A, we'll see whether or not they have interest, and B, we decide whether or not it makes sense to expand that much afterwards. Okay, let's jump into the first topic on the agenda then that was regularly scheduled, which is a discussion around some of the AI impacts, economics, ethics, et cetera. And we have actually two speakers for this. One introduced himself already, Eric, and he'll be going first. And then Mark Nitzenberg, the Executive Director of the Center for Human Compatible AI at Berkeley, will be joining us. I don't believe he's on yet. Oh yes, maybe he just joined. Mark, do I see you on? I think he's on, but on mute.
Yes, I'm up here or down there.
Depending on where you are. Okay, great. So you made it just in time. I knew you had an overlapping meeting. So why don't we start, Eric? Why don't you get started first to talk about what you guys are doing at the Digital Electronics Lab, Economy Lab rather, at Stanford, and then we'll pass over to Mark, and then we'll have an open discussion after that.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me, Jeff. I'm really looking forward. As we're going around the room, it's a bunch of really interesting, illustrious people. So looking forward to the conversation. But you asked me to share a little bit of the research we're doing at the Digital Economy Lab, especially around AI and how it's affecting the economy. So let me just share some PowerPoint slides here. And I think it's this one. And there, can you see the slides? Let me talk about what I'm calling the AI awakening and what it means for productivity and the future of work. I'm an economist. I have an appointment at the Department of Economics and the business school, although my main appointment since I came over from MIT last year is in the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. And I'm spending a lot of time these days thinking about how AI is changing the economy. And just as some background, I'm sure you guys know there's been some remarkable progress in AI, especially around machine learning the past decade, which is why I'm so excited about it. One archetypal example is what's happened, the ability to recognize images. Here's some data from ImageNet that my Stanford colleague Fei Li put together with about 14 million images. I used to say that was something that humans could do and machines can't do very well. But about a decade ago, Jeff Hinton and his colleagues introduced deep learning techniques, and very rapidly, machines were able to recognize images very well, arguably better than humans now in many contexts, not all contexts. So they've actually stopped doing the ImageNet competition. But it's not just image recognition, and you could use that, of course, not just for faces and antelopes and gazelles, but also for cancer and other kinds of pathologies. And that's gotten to be very important in medical imaging. But it's so many other things, almost anything where you can get a lot of digital data as an input and map it to data as an output. If you have labeled data, you can train a system. Everyone sitting around the Zoom today has, I'm sure, many applications in their organization that would be suitable for training supervised learning systems. And there's sort of a gold rush going on right now as people find more and more ways of using these enormous data sets and training neural nets to answer questions about them and be able to map from inputs into outputs. And I'm not going to talk more about the technology, but I'm welcome to discuss that if you'd like. What I want to talk about is some of the economic implications. Specifically, one is around what's happening with productivity, and the second one is what's happening to the nature of work in society. So somewhat to my surprise and disappointment, when we looked at the data, we did not see that this was having much of an effect on productivity. In fact, over the past 10, 15 years, productivity growth has slowed down. Now, just to be clear, the level of productivity is still growing, but it's growing at a much slower rate than it used to. In the 90s and early 2000s, productivity grew at about 2.8% per year in the United States. Since then, it's grown about half as fast, at 1.4% per year. Of course, it bounces around a bit from year to year, but it's actually been kind of disappointing. And we've had a slew of amazing technologies that have emerged, and yet we're not seeing much of an improvement in productivity, not as much as we used to see. And it's not just the United States. If you look at almost every OECD country, there has been a significant and pretty comparable slowdown. So it's a worldwide phenomena. Greece was the only one that didn't have a slowdown, but that's partly because they had such poor progress beforehand. So what's going on there? Why would it be that we're not seeing this technology translate into rapidly rising living standards. You know, far from the singularity, we're seeing kind of a stagnation going on. Well, one story is that we're just not measuring things correctly. And GDP is the way that we mainly measure the economy. And productivity is defined as GDP divided by hours worked. So if we mismeasure GDP, we mismeasure productivity. And in particular, the definition of GDP is based on the products that are goods and services that are bought and sold in the economy, which means that if something has zero price, then with few exceptions, it has zero weight in the GDP and productivity metrics. And as we all know, there are more and more goods and services that are available for free. I'm not paying for Zoom, and I have Wikipedia and lots of other goods and services that are zero cost and create tremendous value. And they are not contributing to GDP. In some cases, like in the case of Wikipedia, it's probably net subtracting from GDP as Wikipedia replaces Britannica that we did pay for. There's less spending in that category. You know, there are some nuances in terms of how we deal with advertising, but the broad answer is that there are more and more goods and services that aren't captured in GDP. And, you know, if you look at the data, these goods and services, all the software, internet goods, as well as movies, books, magazines, newspapers, television, they're all in what's called the information sector of the economy. It used to be about 4.7% of the economy back in the early 1980s. It's bounced around a little, but recently it's still around 4.7%. And that's not because this sector hasn't absolutely exploded. We're spending about 6.2 hours per day looking at screens, whether it's little screens like this iPhone or medium-sized screens like the computer or big screens like a TV. We're spending a lot of time consuming these digital goods and services, but more and more time, but it's not showing up in the GDP statistics. So we need to come up with some new metrics. My team at Stanford is developing a new metric we call GDP-B. The B stands for benefits. It's meant to capture the consumer benefits that you get from goods, even if you don't pay for them. So Wikipedia or TikTok may create a lot of consumer benefit, even if consumers don't have to pay anything at all for them. And the way we measure that is we do a bunch of choice experiments where we offer to pay people to stop using the good. Would you stop using Facebook if I paid you $5 per month? What about $20? What about $50? What about $100? Well, some people say yes, some people say no. And by looking at all of those, we get a sense of what the demand curve is. And we've been doing millions of these choice experiments and have collected a lot of data for a lot of digital goods. So we're beginning to get a measure now that suggests that there are hundreds of billions, even trillions of dollars of consumer surplus being created.
That was hilarious. I didn't know you knew each other.
With, sorry? Yeah. So there's a lot of consumer surplus being created, even if we don't have to pay for it. And so GDP-B sits sort of between two existing sets of metrics. One is the traditional GDP and productivity in the lower right there. And then there's also people who've been doing, you know, happiness indicators. Typically, they ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, how happy are you? And different countries answer that in different ways. Maybe happiness is more about what we care about, but asking people on a scale of 1 to 10 how happy theirs is a very crude and imprecise way of measuring a country's well-being. GDP has, you know, 9 significant digits, much more precise, but isn't exactly capturing the right thing. It doesn't capture our well-being. I see GDP-B as being somewhere in between, and you know, there's a lot more we've been doing with that. The other reason, though, that we may not be seeing productivity growth is simply that there are huge lags between inventing a technology and actually having it implemented in a way that changes our well-being and changes the economy. Typically, you know, whether it's electricity or the steam engine or computers or artificial intelligence, it's not enough to invent a cool technology. You have to have factories incorporated and offices transform, new supply chains, new ways of organizing things. When the internet was introduced and people started doing e-commerce, a few years later, Amazon was started in 1994, but it was only last year that Amazon actually passed Walmart in sales. So it was almost 20 years before that really changed that industry as much as it has ultimately. And that 20 or 30-year time frame is not uncommon in introducing these broad general purpose technologies. The same story happened when electricity was introduced. It's about 30 years in that case before we saw significant productivity gains. And that's because while the technology is important, most of the costs and benefits come from complementary business processes and human capital investments. And those are, we've estimated it's about 90% of the investment is in those complementary investments. And those take years to put in place. They create intangible capital that can be to some extent measured. It doesn't typically show up on the balance sheet directly, but we have ways of getting at this magnitude of that. What we found is that most of the intangible capital or digital capital associated with information technology is concentrated in a small subset of the firms. The top 10% of the firms have the vast majority of the investment in that area. And the bottom 80% has hardly any since the year 2000. So it's a very skewed distribution, but it's growing quite rapidly. And that ultimately takes some time before it translates into productivity. In fact, in the short run, it can lead to a negative effect on productivity. Why is that? Because in the short run, you're spending a lot of time and energy in skilling the workforce, investing in new business processes, changing the way you're doing work. That takes energy, effort, capital, labor, but it doesn't immediately translate into additional output. So in that bottom part of the J curve, where the blue line is going downward, that's when you're investing more than you're harvesting. Eventually, you can start harvesting the benefits, and then the J curve turns upward, and you start getting a big payoff. We don't know for sure, but it seems that a big part of the reason for the low productivity recently is that we're at the bottom part of that J curve now. We're just beginning to turn the corner. And now let me just talk a little bit about the transformation of work, and then I look forward to any questions, or I think maybe we're going to Mark. So machine learning is far from an artificial general intelligence. It can only do some things very well, which I'm very impressed by, but there are most things that humans do cannot be done by any of these technologies. And we looked at about 18,000 specific tasks that are done in the workforce. The majority of them, the vast majority of them, could not be done by any current technology. For instance, many people give the example of radiologists and how machines can read medical images, and that's true, better than humans in most cases now. But there are these many other things like administering sedation that we don't want or able to get machines to be able to do right now. And in fact, the majority of the 27 tasks that radiologists do are not things that machine can or we would want them to do. And a similar pattern we saw for all the other 950 occupations we looked at. There was not a single one where machine learning and related technologies ran the table and was able to do them all. In every case, humans were important for some, in most cases, the majority of the tasks. You can map this up to the level of firms and see not just which occupations are affected, but which firms are affected. For instance, the right scatter plot there looks at which firms have different kinds of skills, AI skills, and also which firms have tasks that are suitable for machine learning. Walmart is the red dot. They're in the upper right corner. And it's somewhat above most firms in terms of having a lot of workers with skills in AI, but it's also above most firms being towards the top, having a lot of tasks that are done in their warehouses and their stores and in their offices that could potentially be done by machines. And we can do an analysis for every firm in the economy this way we have about how vulnerable they are to machine learning, and also how likely they are to be able to address them. And we see over time that the share of exposed tasks is growing quite rapidly, but unevenly in the economy. So let me just summarize by saying that these technologies are quite powerful. They're already here. I touched on one of them, machine learning, but we've been analyzing remote work and others. But by themselves, the technology does not boost productivity. There's a measurement issue. There's also an issue of having to invent new processes, new skills, and that leads to this J curve, which from our analysis is actually in a way optimistic, because it means that we've kind of done a lot of harvesting, a lot of investment over the past decade, and we're ready to start harvesting that in the coming decade. So I think the 2020s will be an era of significantly higher productivity growth. But in order to do that, you're going to need to know which sorts of skills are needed in the future. And these large data sets we have, where we have looked at hundreds of millions of job postings and resume profiles, give us some visibility into which firms have those skills and which firms don't have those skills. So you can read a lot more about this on my website at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. I have a company I'm helping called WorkHelix that has implemented a lot of this, or you can go to my own webpage and read all the papers there for free. Looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Eric. That's great. That's exactly. I remember seeing, particularly the productivity stuff is actually fascinating to me. You know, I try to figure out how all the free stuff that we now take for granted actually affects our ability to measure what we're getting as value out from AI.
Yeah, we need, you know, for the 21st century, we need a new set of metrics that the GDP was amazing for the 20th century, but I think we're gonna have to update it.
Yeah, that's good. Let's go to Mark and say, talk a little bit about what he wanted to say, and then we'll open discussion up on both at the same time. So Mark, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
I will see whether I can share a few slides as well, and I'll be brief. It is an honor to speak to you and to follow Eric. Thank you for having me. I just recently was asked to speak to probably the best funded AI research lab in the world, which is in China. And they asked me to give a lighthouse sweep of the ethical issues in AI. And I thought that was very interesting that they asked an American to talk about ethics. I am with the Berkeley AI Research Lab with these 60 professors and about 200 PhD students and thousands of undergrads, and they all care about the societal impacts of what we're building. And I'll just give you the quick lighthouse sweep, and I will skip over the jobs question. But we are particularly concerned with the long-term implications of retaining control over systems that are becoming increasingly powerful. An issue that was brought up by Alan Turing sometime before there was even a theoretical study of computer science. And then for everything that is, you know, short of the idea of a runaway system that wipes out humanity, we just need to be sure that we're scaling with care. And so just a quick survey. There are issues of safety in transportation and health and infrastructure, cybersecurity, and all the things that need to be safeguarded. And we need standards as we have with any other kind of engineering systems to assure safety. And so that's a sort of a number one area. And then you probably have heard about fairness and transparency and accountability. And this is a burgeoning area of concern where things go wrong. AI amplifies practices because it's based on data. The data doesn't capture our ideals or our desired norms or our laws. It captures our practices. And so things have been going wrong in many areas that we haven't even necessarily paid attention to until AI was amplifying what we were doing. There's, of course, the area of privacy and health and finance and so forth. And this is just an example of Google Street View. We were working with the fellow who actually started Street View, and the kinds of things that he ran into when he brought it around the world to Germany. In Germany, it was determined that if you didn't want your building in Street View, you could have it blocked, and so that's one of the things, just a small example. And then the only thing I'll say about labor is that automation, you know, as Eric has spent a career studying, automation moves labor markets, and I will just say that automation and policy really determine the way these things will be impacting us, and so we need to pay attention to policy. And then to a very special interest of mine, media integrity. Content recommenders are the systems that determine what you see first and what you see next on YouTube or on Facebook or in a news feed or Amazon search results, Google search results. And those recommender systems really determine their influence, and they're greatly influential from mixed quality information sources, right? And the consequences are sometimes difficult to prove in terms of causality, but clearly there are offline harms from these online recommender systems, and this is largely uncharted territory in regulation and law, and a real ethical challenge in AI. Fortunately, the engineers and designers working on these systems that make the recommendations of what we see and read care about the social impacts of their work. There's a fellow named Jonathan Stray at CHI, at our center, who is really one of the world authorities on this, and has just released a blog post that I will share a link to that describes the recommender systems and the ways in which we're looking at them. And then there are questions of the ethical issues of lethal autonomous weapons, weapons that engage independently and make decisions on life or death decisions, and finally the big question of catastrophic AI. And so on the optimistic side, regulation is really on the rise, and there's a lot on the horizon that I think you will be discussing today. And I have a great deal of optimism about that. So thank you very much. I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Mark. So that's good. So I think it's kind of a whirlwind view of some of the ethical other issues that come along with AI, as we also think about the economic and productivity impacts. So we'll just open up for general discussion. I guess one question I wanted to just start off with, and it's on a little bit on the ethics and regulation that you were touching on, but I'd like to hear both your comments on it, which is, what is the right role for regulation and policy around AI right now, not only for maybe the ethical concerns and misuse of it, but also even for concerns, misplaced or not, about whether or not it's going to affect labor markets or replace jobs that we don't want necessarily replaced at the rate we can find other work for those people. It's open to either one of you to start.
I'll start. That's a very broad question, and there's a lot of different things one can do. Let me focus on the labor market, and particularly that there's already been significant effects of technology on the labor market, not so much from AI, but from some of the other types of information technology. And the effects have been that it has, on average, increased productivity and led to higher standards of living. But it's also been very uneven. There's no economic law that everyone is going to benefit evenly. And in fact, it's possible, and in the case that in some cases that some people have been made worse off as the technology automates some types of routine information processing and routine work. People doing those jobs have found their wages fall. The wages of people with only a high school education are lower now than they were 30 years ago, even though average wages are up somewhat. So there's been these uneven effects. What can you do? Well, there are different things you can do. You can invest more in education and training. You can invest in other policies that redeploy people into new areas as old jobs disappear. You can have progressive income taxing. You can have earned income tax credit, which is a kind of a wage subsidy. These are all policies you can put in place that cushion or reverse the blow of that. To the extent you don't do that, there's often a backlash. And one of the reasons that there was a backlash against globalization was that although free trade also led to a bigger overall pie, it was very uneven. And a lot of people felt like it wasn't working for them. And for now, both parties are opposed by and large to free trade, responding to the electorate. And I worry a little bit that similar things are emerging with the tech backlash, that people feel like they're not getting the benefits from technology. And rather than speed up our adaptation to technology, some people want to slow down the progress of technology. And in the long run, that would be, I think, bad for everyone.
Okay. Mark, how about in the ethics space?
Well, in fact, the people that I work with in Eric's world talk about, I just to add to what Eric said, three broad kinds of policy, regulatory interventions for work. One is lifelong education, right, and training policies that give the skills that will give the people access to good jobs, and active labor market policies to help them transition to the jobs. And then second, there's extension of social benefits and legal protections to cover workers in all businesses, including the platform businesses, the so-called sharing economy workers. And third, some income support policies that minimum wages and tax credits and the kinds of things that Eric mentioned. Over in the world of recommender systems, the big tech firms are really asking for regulation from the outside. One way that we think about it, and we're putting together a position paper and hope to have some influence on this, but there are some good starts to regulation in Europe and also on the floor of the Congress, that the recommenders, everyone understands that just maximizing so-called engagement, keeping people glued, doesn't work as a recommender, basic recommender system. And what we really believe will improve things, and we'll be working together with some of the companies to try these out. But there are a lot of internal studies that we don't hear about. It requires having a small number of social, of metrics, of measures of social goals. So just to take a simple example, anorexia or depression or something like that, and have a way of measuring that, and then factor that into the objective function for making choices about what you put in front of people. And there are, there's some reason to believe that will actually have the desired social effect.
Interesting. Okay. Bill, you got a hand up.
Yeah, just a question. I mean, if I have my statistics nominally right, I think at the turn of the last century, about 30% of the American workforce was involved in manufacturing and 40% was in agriculture. And roll the clock forward 100 years, and those numbers are respectively about 3% and 4%. So this is not the first time we've seen a massive transition in the work environment as a result of technology. I mean, this has been happening for more than 150 years, probably. So it's not a new problem; it's a different flavor of the problem. But just like that inevitable impact. I mean, one of the problems of that dynamic has been the nature of work and what we've all decried as this bifurcation of the economy into the haves who are at the higher echelons and have are well educated and have the high paying jobs, and the disappearance of the working class that was basically an agricultural or manufacturing working class that is now in the service sector that absolutely doesn't pay as well. And you can't sustain a household stacking shelves at Amazon or waiting on tables. So I think that at the same time, AI is a train you're not going to stop, nor is globalization. And the social reactions to these, I think, are an inevitable result of inactivity on the policy side, right? So it does seem to me that what really needs to happen here is, public awareness and policy making that acknowledges these issues and then, brings policy to bear on coming up with solutions. But, we're not going to change it. We can do things as tech companies or users or implementers or even, advocates of AI, but we're not going to solve the problem without policy help, I don't think. Just interested if
I think your point about previous tech revolutions is very important and insightful. There was most of the workforce in agriculture. If you go back even to the 1800s, it was north of 90%.
Yeah.
America led the world in the 1800s in introducing primary education, and a lot of countries thought that was kind of wacky, that take people off of the farm and teach them to read and write. Yeah. And then in the 20th century, it led the world with the high school movement and later the GI Bill, and had the most educated workforce. And it's not a coincidence, it also had the highest living standard and also one of the most equal distributions of income, because there are a lot of people who do those jobs. America is no longer a leader in a lot of areas of education the way it used to be. Partly that's good news. Other countries are catching up, but partly it's disappointing that we haven't continued to make investments. And there are things like the progressive income tax and Social Security. There are a whole lot of other social policies that were introduced that try to create broadly shared prosperity. So I share your point that it's certainly possible to implement policies that cushion or even enhance the benefits to the broad group of people. The past 20 or 30 years, we haven't done that as much. And as a consequence, there are a lot of people who are falling behind. I'm a mindful optimist. I'm not a blind optimist. I don't think it's automatically going to work out for the best for everybody. But I do think that if we are proactive and conscious about not just government policy, but also what companies are doing, what we're doing as individuals, we can have the next 10 years be probably the best 10 years that we've ever had in the country, but it's far from inevitable.
Well, I think that, that's the key point is that inactivity, right, or inaction is going to be our downfall. I think you've just outlined a pretty key part of the solution. If what you just said could be a front page article on every newspaper in the country and, on CNN and Fox, that might move the needle a little bit. But yeah, I think just maybe for all of us advocating awareness and policy to face this issue and be proactive about solutions. And I couldn't agree with you more that education, like let's educate the workforce, because, that's where things are moving. And, those left behind are going to be left behind in a very problematic way for everybody.
If we only figure out a way to have memes that encourage educating the workforce, getting as many clicks as Facebook needs to keep them in their algorithm, we'd be in good shape. But we have a ways to go, I think, on that.
Yeah.
Brian Spears had a question. He couldn't get his hand up, so.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question first to Eric, and then I think it goes to Mark as well. I was really intrigued and I resonated a lot with the notion of the lag between innovation and then implementation that actually reaps some benefit. I think lots of us who are working in this space that this group is considering can see that tools have developed and that there are a few years of work to do to make real progress, but it's going to be transformative for us and we're not there yet. So to Eric, my thoughts are in two parts. One, have you thought about a time delay measurement, looking back at historical cases and the impact that they've had? And is there a way to help us think about the current, to make a future value estimate in an economic sense of what we've done now? And second, if you have, let us know, because for those of us who are making investments in the R&D space, we have all of these innovations and some of them I think are going to flow forward well and some of them are not. And we need to be able to do test cases and think about value added in the way it interacts with other tools. And then if I could just tack on there for Mark, since these things seem to change in a lagging sense like that, how do you see the ethical impact? It's hard if you can't evaluate the value that you have right now to predict what the impact is going to be in the future. And it seems like the ethical problems evolve in place. We didn't understand misinformation via social media 20 years ago, but we do now. And when did the frog get cooked in the boiling pot? So maybe a complicated question, but I hope you two caught it. And if not, I'm happy to restate anything.
Great question, and it's super important. I am spending more and more time trying to understand what I call the productivity J curve. And I just published a paper on this last year. We went through the analytics of what happens and the process by which, when you invest in a technology, and the more impactful the technology is, the more of a general purpose technology is what economists call it, like the steam engine, electricity, computerization, the more important it is to invent complementary innovations, not just necessarily just technological, although those are important, but often the most important ones are business processes and skills. And there are a number of people who wrote before me, like Paul David and others, who described how there were these enormous lags. In the case of electricity, Paul David described about a 30-year lag where he got the records from the factories. And to tell you a little, I think it's kind of an interesting story. When factories first electrified, they took out the steam engine and they put in the biggest electric motor they could find. And then they pulled up these pulleys and crankshafts, and everything was back in business. It didn't really lead to much of a productivity gain. For some reason, even when they started building totally new factories, they used that same model. But after about 30 years, which coincidentally is how long it takes for a generation of managers to retire or die, you started finally seeing new factories. And the new factories were kind of like what we see today, where each piece of equipment had its own small separate electric motors. Unlike steam engines, electric motors can be quite small and still be efficient. And so you see these factories laid out not based on who needed to be near the power source, but based on the flow of materials. And then the record showed that productivity didn't just go up a little bit, it doubled and tripled, like 200 or 300% improvements in productivity. It was just staggering. But it was just very striking that it wasn't the electricity per se that triggered this. It was the combination of the electricity plus a completely new way of organizing production. And I think it's a great metaphor or analogy to some of the things we're seeing today, where, take, someone mentioned Amazon. Suppose that Jeff Bezos had said, we've got computers now, let's take each of the cashiers and replace them with a robot. And we'll leave the bookstore the same, but have a robot cashier. That would have been a very boring and unproductive way to bring technology to a bookstore. Instead, he and many others had to reinvent the whole supply chain and how books are delivered. And that has been immensely more productive. But it's that kind of reconceiving the way you do the work where most of the benefits come from, but also something that frankly requires a lot more creativity. And takes time to implement. And so it's not so easy as it is to just kind of swap in a piece of machinery. But that paper I put in the chat there, the productivity J curve, describes a little bit more some of the analytics where we've gathered data from lots of different, in that paper, by the way, it shows that there are lots of overlapping J curves. It's not just one J curve. There's different ones for different technologies. And you can see them each having this effect where there's a downward effect and then an upward effect.
Great, thanks. That's fantastic. Yeah,
Brian,
very much like to think about it. Sorry,
what
Mark.
was this? What was the second part of the question?
Yeah, the part for you, Mark, was given that it's hard to see the impact of these technologies, and sometimes their implementation requires, as Eric just said, some creativity to rearrange. Yeah. How do you grapple with the time evolution of the ethics, since presumably that evolution could be difficult?
So one of my favorite proteges now, a colleague, Tom Gilbert, spent his entire machine ethics PhD talking to people about, what's going to happen when we actually have cars driving, autonomously, and trying to anticipate it before it happens, right, and try to get things right. I think it was very hard at the time of the horseless carriage to anticipate all of the impacts that it would have. Right? If we knew that it was going to kill 40,000 people a year in the United States, would we have allowed it, to go without certain guardrails and so forth? And so I think it's a terrific question. It's been proposed in various different ways that new algorithms that are being released, that will touch billions of lives, be tested on fewer lives. In some way before they're released to the billions.
Clinical trials.
In a sense. And I thought I was very clever, and I wrote an article that I think came out in Wired about this in 2017 or 2018, but it turns out that there was a study in the early 2000s about this. And it probably has a long history, but I think there are some thoughts along those lines. But it's a question of having and this is the way things are done more in Europe than in the United States, to put regulation around something that doesn't exist yet, because it might be dangerous. But it's not a bad idea.
Thank you both so much. It makes me think there's an interesting metric of, GDPC or some new metric divided by ethical risk, and you want to evolve that ratio. You would accept the cars, you might accept 40,000 deaths if you knew that the GDP was going to explode by orders of magnitude, and maybe not the other way around. Great ideas. Thanks so much, both of you.
Ming.
Yes. So, Eric, you made a really good point about when it comes to AI, there is certainly a lot of disparity in terms of benefits, how it benefits different segments of the society. And I think that also relates to a different point that Mark made, which is in addition to the disparity in benefits, there's also huge disparity in impact. They impact different people in different ways. So I look at over 5,000 different innovations in AI over the past 2 years. I think I'm seeing the disparity in a different way, in a sense that just like every technology, every time when people invest money, invest resource, they think about return on investment. They think about, okay, if I spend this much money on AI, how much return am I getting? And so when I look at the AI innovation through that lens, I'm seeing the disparity as well, because I'm seeing a lot of investment in healthcare AI, a lot of investment in fraud prevention AI, a lot of investment in gaming AI, and some investment in self-driving. So my question to you is, all of those investments are in a way affected by the return on investment calculation. So the question is, are you seeing a huge imbalance in terms of the areas where people is willing to put the resources in just because they can make a big leap in terms of the return, versus the areas where AI can do really well, can really change people's life, can make them better, but they are facing some sort of imbalance in a way that people are not spending a lot of resources or enough resources in those areas where people can get benefited the most, or AI can do even a bigger impact on our lives.
It's a really interesting question. I think that we are seeing very uneven effects and very uneven investments. I'm here at Stanford now, and Sand Hill Road is just behind that window there by the Stanford Dish Trail, for those of you who know that. And, I talked to a lot of the VCs there, and there's a very powerful economic incentive to create tools that open up billion and even, in some cases, $100 billion or $1 trillion markets. Those are not necessarily the ones where that benefit the most people. It helps to benefit a lot of people, but there are a lot of people who don't have a lot of money. And if you use it to help cure malaria or help people who are starving, they're not in a position to pay a lot of money. If you do something that helps fellow billionaires a little bit, that might be something that has a big economic payoff. So there's a bit of a skew right now in the economic system. There are a lot of people who are mission driven in their startups and are doing things for non-economic purposes. But powerful as capitalism is as an incentive system to get people to innovate, it doesn't provide equal incentives for all kinds of innovations. And so I do hear some of the folks who are, especially VCs, talking about how there's a skew towards a certain kind of product that where a lot of the investment is going, and it's not benefiting people as broadly as maybe it could. I guess the other thing you could say is in many cases it sort of trickles down. I don't know if that's probably, I can probably think of a less pejorative way, but there are many innovations that are first designed for very wealthy people that then benefit people more broadly. But that's not necessarily the way the incentives are aligned initially.
Stefan.
Yeah, great presentations. I really enjoyed both of them. I just have a quick question regarding virtual reality, augmented reality, and as we, I guess, looking at labor and also the ethics of it. So if either of you could elaborate, it'd be great. Thank you.
I think you broke a little bit. But you're basically asking what's the impact of VR and AR on both sort of labor as well as on the ethics? Is that was the question?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
You want to go first, Mark, or do you want me to?
Yes, I'm not sure I have anything really intelligent to opine about that because there's an aspect of virtual reality that we are now experiencing at this moment, right? We are, virtually together in a room. We're having a roundtable discussion, I guess only an armchair economist. So I'm going to hand it over to Eric. What are the
well, Eric's not here. I'm actually his avatar, but you want to get to Eric. No, it is interesting as we spend more and more time in this virtual world. And I sometimes I had a good conversation with a physicist a little while back about, dialing a few clicks forward when we spend, most of our time in a virtual reality. I guess there's some people who think we already are and we just don't know it. And one interesting thing is that the economics could be very different if you have zero marginal cost of producing bits. People can have castles and piles of gold and all sorts of other stuff that would be expensive to have in the physical world, but essentially costless in the virtual world. It's kind of fun as a dinner conversation, maybe at some point as a research project, to think about what's scarce in a world where, in a virtual reality world where a lot of goods and services can be delivered virtually. There are still some things that I think would be scarce, like status, and there are some things that maybe intrinsically would still be expensive, but a lot of other things would be available, would be very abundant. It would be an interesting kind of economy. One thing you do see as the world becomes more digital networks is that you move from kind of normal distributions of payoffs towards more of a power law distribution. So in network theory, there's something called the preferential attachment theory. Many of you may know about that the rich get richer. So people who have a lot of Twitter followers are more likely to run into new Twitter followers and get even more of them. And so you tend to get a kind of a power law distribution. And in many cases, the virtual world is therefore much, much more skewed towards a small number of winners and a long tail of people who don't have as many interactions or followers or potentially economic impact.
I think it's interesting too, you talk about the scarcity. I think this kind of mania around NFTs is an attempt to create scarcity, right? To make something now, which in theory can be reproduced over and over, suddenly make it scarce by making it a one of a kind. And obviously, we see this in the art world where the signature of Picasso makes a big difference, but creating it in a digital world would be interesting to see how that plays out long term.
That's a really good point. That for some reason, I think the economics are that if something is abundant, then supply and demand, it tends to have zero price. So if you want to have something expensive, you have to make it scarce, and I guess in some cases make it artificially scarce.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll take the last two questions. Start with Sean and then to Maria.
Thanks, Jeff. I wanted to come back to something that you touched on a moment ago, Mark, which is on sort of regulation and sort of two approaches to it. One would be maybe self-regulation by companies. The other end, there would be maybe the traditional European approach of precautionary regulation. Let's control something or manage something before we have an issue. And from the economic standpoint, and this may be to you also, Eric, I can see where from the long list of things that you listed in your slides, Mark, about all these issues, including catastrophic ones and can we control it, that would argue for a more or less precautionary approach to the idea that, well, if we go too far with that, we're going to forestall innovation. And then maybe we don't do it, but the Chinese do it, or something like that. So I guess the question is, like, ideally, who sets the standards? How do you come to the right kind of balance and formula about what kind of regulation is necessary and when, and who sets them?
I don't have a good answer to that one. I'm really sorry. It's a really important question, and I hope groups like this are grappling with it, because the technology is becoming more and more powerful, more and more impactful, and maybe irreversible. That you raised some of the things that make it a difficult question to answer, like suppose that the European Union put in place some standards. Does that mean that innovation flees the United States or to China? If the U.S. stops developing autonomous lethal weapons, would that put them at a disadvantage in battling, well, let me say China again, or other countries? Those are real challenges, and not hypothetical ones, I think. So it becomes a tough problem to answer, and I'm thinking about it, but I don't have an answer for you.
Well, I feel quite strongly that the reason for the reason for government, what we enter into in terms of a social contract is meant to solve the ethical problem of fair distribution of burdens and benefits, right? We want to, right? And maybe it's another way of saying the same thing, and that there are real lines that if you cross them, you are creating danger to others that is so great it is not worth crossing that line. And that's where the regulation is pretty straightforward, right? If you are going to kill 40,000 people, it's probably a bad idea, right? To have no responsibility, and part of the one direction is liability. Although you can't, you really need teeth in that kind of regulation or competition policy, and Europe is trying, I think, with some of their regulations. They really are based on a model of, I think. Consumer protection, right? The initial, Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act really are protecting the consumer from dangers and harms and so forth. And so those regulations are pretty straightforward. The same kinds of regulations that control medical devices and drugs and so forth. But there certainly is a very large gray area of social harms where you cannot prove causality between online activity and offline harm, right? And then what do you do? And that's what we're grappling with.
Maria, we'll give you the last question before we move to our next topic.
Really fascinating topic, and coming at it from the healthcare, life sciences sector, and precision medicine, and where we're going with that, especially with the types of gene therapy approaches, and genomics, kind of marrying all the information explosion from genomics, epigenomics, omics data sets, and coming up with solutions for healthcare. So from that perspective, a couple of questions. CIRM also, in addition to funding the projects itself, also funds educational programs. And one of the gaps that we've recognized, and it's a conversation also at the national academies, is this gap between those who are the content or the knowledge generators, like the scientists, and then the computational folks. And in terms of, then how do you bridge that gap in terms of how to have the best application? I just bring it up as not as a statement more than anything else, in case there, I think somebody had mentioned that it's really important in education and in terms of how to socialize how AI fits into our world, that it's at the education level as well. So I know that there may not be response, but I really, if something comes across from your perspective that you think would be useful in terms of how we could design educational programs, because we are trying to build that component. But another question that I had was about the application and investment into the space. And one of the things that was really intriguing at one of the conferences I went to at the Vatican, where initially it was like 3 years ago, and Samsung was first, kind of rolling out some of their virtual reality projects. It occurred to me, and some of the examples were in the paralyzed, and having the experience of running and walking, and those, with mood disorders. Is there an interest in the investment community? Do you think that, is there enough of an interest to bring this forward for maybe disadvantaged communities, who may have mental health issues, et cetera, so that, the driver is the haves, right? But in gaining that traction, could it then spread out in that way? I know I kind of bundled everything, but I think this was just so fascinating that I wanted to just share with you how I looked at it from the perspective of the world that we play in.
Well, thanks, Maria. That was really interesting, important. I am working on trying to understand what the new skills are that will be more in demand going forward. And so in my book, The Second Machine Age, we talk quite a bit about broadly what those are, but we're also getting much more fine-grained. We've looked at several 100 million job postings that we've scanned, and we've done natural language processing on them. And we have a little fun tool we call Work2Vec that vectorizes all those job postings, so we can see how skills are changing over time and which ones are becoming more important, and what we call skill adjacencies, that there may be somebody, maybe there's a growing demand, for instance, for cyber. It's a huge area. Not many people have that skill specifically, but we found that there are some very close adjacencies in some of the accounting areas, actually, the forensic accounting stuff that people can learn. There are people, there's a big need for machine learning folks, and some people with data science skills could learn Python or TensorFlow and add to that. So we're looking at people who are almost there, but not quite there. And then you only need to add a little bit. And so most companies have billions of dollars worth of human capital. It doesn't show up in their balance sheet, but that's the biggest asset in every firm. It's not just a slogan, but they don't really have a way of measuring it. And the company I'm helping work, Helix, seeks to measure it and then show them how, instead of like laying off one group of people and hiring a new group of people, they in most cases could retrain some of their existing workforce. They just don't know. They don't know what they know. They don't know what information is already in their company. And making that more visible, I think, is going to be a big step towards tapping. I mean, the number is just staggering. It's like there's about 200 trillion with a T dollars worth of human capital in the U.S. economy. So if you can just make that just 1% or 2% more productive, just imagine what the payoff is from that. And we think we can do that by having better visibility into it.
That's great. Well, thanks, Eric. That's an optimistic note too to end this on, which is good as well. I do think you're right with the training stuff. We actually also been looking into how AI can actually help workers who maybe don't have skills to do certain jobs, but with using AI, they actually do have the skills to do those jobs. So it's not just they replace the jobs, it actually enables workforce you wouldn't expect otherwise.
Right. Something, I guess, one of the papers I put in the agenda was the Turing trap, and we never really got a chance to talk about that, but it's all about this distinction between automating versus augmenting. And what you just described, Jeff, is the way that these tools can augment people a lot and allow them to do new things they never could have before. And that's where the biggest payoff tends to be.
Good. Agreed. Yeah. So I do. Thanks for the call. That if you look at your agenda that got sent out in the email, there are some links to some books and other references for all the talks, including what Eric just mentioned, as well as some things that we put in the chat here as we were going through. We'll try to collect those all up before the Zoom ends, and I hope we can grab those, and we'll try and send those out in the follow-up email. But you might want to grab a couple as well. So thanks, Mark and Eric, for a very stimulating conversation. I think this is great food for thought from a couple different angles. You're welcome to stay on for the rest of the meeting, but you're also welcome to go off, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. Really, yeah, it's a delight, and good seeing you, Mark, as well. And thank you for inviting us.
Good. Thanks.
I've got a dash. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so the next on our agenda is there's been actually everything else on the agenda now is various policy things that are going on and that we thought would be worth having a discussion